Okay, welcome back, guys. We're going to continue with cardiovascular system. This is going to be a short one, not too much to go. This is going to be broken up into two videos actually, so not a lot left. Here's where we left off. We were talking about the movement of blood through the vessels. Remember, we were focusing on the vessels last time. We were talking about how we have three major vessels: arteries, veins, and capillaries. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. Veins carry blood back towards the heart. Capillaries exchange the contents of blood with the cells of the body. Remember, there were some specifics associated to that we talked about in this slide here, talking about how the arteries are thicker than the walls of the arteries are thicker than the veins. The lumens of the veins, which is the inner diameter, is going to be much larger. And then we talked also about how the blood actually moves. The blood in the arteries moves by the heart, whereas the blood in the veins moves through this milking process. Okay. Regarding the capillaries, we don't need to dive too deep into this. This is kind of more like on a capillary bed level, so like a much more molecular cellular level. But there's this thing called the vascular shunt that we don't need to dive too deep into. Like I said, it connects the arterial to the venual, so just connect the two. The things that are exchanged between capillaries, this is stuff that we already learned in circulatory system. Oxygen and nutrients, carbon dioxide and metabolic waste, it's all stuff in blood. Here we're able to see I really like picture A because it's just showing us what's actually going on. But here we're able to see the capillary with a bunch of blood flowing through it, right? That blood is going to carry the nutrients which your cells need. So that nutrients is going to transfer over via diffusion into the cells. When the cells utilize all those nutrients, it's going to kick out all the waste product. And then that's going to re-enter the blood and then circulate and continue. Okay, factors affecting blood flow. We do need to know these three things, so let's go ahead and talk about that real quick. So 3 factors that can affect blood flow. Size of the lumen. If the lumen is too small, so again, the example I gave in the previous video is like a mixing straw versus a drinking straw. If it's like a mixing straw, you're physically just not going to be able to take in as much fluid. So in this case, a smaller lumen makes blood flow more difficult. It's also a reason why if you're donating blood and they utilize one of the vessels in your arms, they try to go for a vein because you're just going to have more blood in that area. Amount of blood. Too much blood can vastly increase blood pressure. Not enough blood can decrease blood pressure. More often than not, it's not a circumstance where you have too much blood. More often than not, it's a circumstance where you don't have enough blood, and that can cause some serious issues with blood pressure. And then finally, viscosity. Viscosity is the state of being thick or semi-fluid. So I can actually fix that real quick. It's not or semi-fluid. So water, for instance, is not viscous at all. Water is just fluid. It's just liquid. Whereas glue or syrup is very viscous. It's sort of fluid, but it kind of flows very slowly. It doesn't really keep its shape as well. Water doesn't really either. It takes the shape of whatever thing it's in, but we get the point. The higher the viscosity, the slower the blood will flow. That's what we end up observing. So if it's more viscous, it's going to be even slower to flow along. How do you affect the viscosity of blood? It's mostly water. Just make sure you're drinking adequate amounts of water. Okay, some normal range values here that we need to discuss. Certain components of blood need to be within a certain range to be considered healthy. So for instance, cholesterol. This is stuff that we talked about in our our macromolecules unit, which was a ways away. Total cholesterol levels that you want to be careful with. You want to have your total cholesterol levels less than 200 milligrams per deciliter. That's the number you need to remember. What about HDL? Remember, HDL is the good type of cholesterol. So we get that from like nuts and seeds and healthy oils and fish. We want more of this stuff. So you're going to have less than 60 milligrams per deciliter. Greater than 60 milligrams per deciliter. And then finally, with LDL, low density lipoprotein, this is the stuff that you don't want as much. With regards to LDL, we get that primarily from our meats and animal products. So, like I said, meat, dairy. Since you don't want as much of this, you're going to want to restrict how much you get. So less than 100 milligrams per deciliter. These are the numbers that we typically observe. So total cholesterol less than 200, HDL greater than 60, LDL less than 100. That's what we want to try to achieve. Okay. Vital signs. Regarding our vital signs, It's a typo there. Regarding our vital signs, there are a number of vital signs that are done anytime you go to a doctor's office. Arterial pulse, blood pressure, respiratory rate, body temperature. 3 of those are really common. Respiratory rate is not normally done when you're going to like a regular checkup or like a physical, for instance. However, if you have a respiratory condition like asthma, they may check your respiratory rate to make sure everything's good. The rest of these are very common. Arterial pulse is always measured to find your heart rate. Blood pressure, that's more associated with how hard is your heart working. Super important, and we'll talk more about that in our last video. And then body temperature, that's all about homeostasis, 98.6. Your body likes to maintain its regular body temperature. All of these are indicators of how efficient your body system is. Okay, regarding your pulse, I would make sure we know what a pulse is, right? Just understand it's a pressure wave of blood. That pressure wave comes from the heart. When the heart pulses and when the heart squeezes and contracts, imagine like waves crashing on a beach, but instead of the waves actually crashing, it's just undulating. So it's riding its way through your blood. There are a number of spots in the body called pressure points. Specifically, there are 9. Just a good idea to know that there are 9 spots in the body to measure your pulse. There's other parts of the body, but not as easy to find. That's the best way to put it, or not as identifiable. So let's go through a couple of these. Temporal, that's in the temples. I always think of like Professor X from X-Men, right? And the theme for this, by the way, is always you use 2 fingers, your index and your middle, to find your pulse. You need to apply a decent amount of pressure. Not a lot. You're not trying to hurt yourself, but enough. And be patient. Be patient, kind of move your fingers around and be like, I don't really feel it. And then eventually you're going to lock onto it and be like, oh, got it. Facial artery is on the jaw. That one can be a little bit tricky, but it's on the jawline. So I typically find it like right on the jawline where it meets the cheek area. Carotid, that's a major one. It's on your neck. I'm going to circle that one. That's a very well-known one. In a lot of like gory films, when somebody gets their neck slit and that blood fountain starts to occur, that is typically associated with the carotid being ruptured. And that's pretty factual. In the instance of the carotid being ruptured and you have an open wound, you can bleed out within seconds. So you have to be very, very careful with the carotid artery. But that's found on the side of the neck. That's an easy one. A lot of people reach for that one, especially like medical professionals, like EMTs, for instance. Brachial is in the middle of the arm. Brachial artery is also super important to blood pressure. Radial, that's another one I'm going to circle. Your radial artery is found on the radius. This is a super easy one. If you follow your thumb down as if you're looking for the radius, which is the bone, and you press with 2 fingers, you'll find it right here. Right where I'm pressing my 2 fingers, my index and my middle finger. But it's on the outside of the arm, right where the hand meets the wrist. Super simple to find. In my opinion, one of the easiest ones to get. Then we have your femoral. No one really is going to be searching for this because it's in your groin area. Then your popliteal, right behind the knee. Pretty easy to feel if you're bending your knees. Posterior tibial is going to be on your ankle. It's close to your It's close to your Achilles tendon. And then finally, the dorsalis pedis is on the top of your foot. So you would need to have like your shoes off and socks off to feel that. Okay. All right. Finally, just to conclude, we got to talk a little bit about blood pressure. Blood pressure is something super important, especially to test how healthy your heart is. Is it working too hard or not? So it's a measurement by health professionals made on the pressure of large arteries. There's 2 things that we're measuring: systolic pressure and diastolic pressure. Systolic pressure is the pressure at the peak of ventricular contraction. Hey, wait a second. Remember a couple videos ago we talked about systole, which is part of the cardiac cycle, and we mentioned how systole is basically contraction. It's the same thing. Systolic pressure is just going to be your systole, but it's going to be pressure of the ventricles contracting. Diastolic pressure is going to be when the ventricles relax, which is diastole. Pressure in blood vessels decreases as the distance away from the heart increases. So that's what we observe. That's a big reason why when you do observe blood pressure, when you are measuring blood pressure, you measure it on the arm, on the upper arm. You want to be close to the heart, but you obviously don't want it to be somewhere uncomfortable. For instance, you could theoretically measure your blood pressure from your neck, but by the time it's tightening to cut off circulation, because you have to cut off circulation to measure blood pressure, you'd choke. It wouldn't be a good idea. So your arm is as good as it's going to get. So in this case, they use the brachial artery, which again is a large enough artery that you can also find your pulse here. They apply this device. That device has a super weird name. It's called a sphygmomanometer. Always a weird name to pronounce. These are the old school ones. It's like a cuff that you'd wrap around the upper arm, and then it'd be like a manual like balloon that you pump in order to inflate it. Eventually, you inflate it enough that it cuts off circulation, and then normally these devices would be connected to what looks like a thermometer, but it's not measuring temperature, it's measuring pressure. When it measures the first number, that's going to be your highest number, and that's going to be your systolic pressure. Obviously, it's not always 120, but 120 would be a really good systolic pressure. Then it starts to release a little bit. You release some of the pressure, and so the blood flow starts to flow again. It's not fully released, and it's going to give you your second number. That second number is going to be the diastolic pressure, and below 120, below 120 and below 70 is what we're aiming for. So your diastolic pressure is going to be more of a circumstance where the heart is relaxing. Then they record that number. After everything's been recorded, you take the bag off and you're good to go. Right. So it's a pretty straightforward process overall. Like I said, there's very little slides left, so we'll finish that up in the coming video. All right. So I appreciate it, guys. I will talk to you guys on the next one.